The darkness before 4 in the morning has a particular quality in Colorado territory in the summer of 1875. It is not the soft dark of a town where lamplight bleeds under doors and neighbors are close enough to hear. It is the hard, total dark of a place that does not care whether you are awake or sleeping, living or dead. The mountains hold it in. The creek at the bottom of the slope moves through it without disturbing it. And in a small, low-ceilinged house on a rented acre at the eastern edge of Harrow Creek, a young woman named Wren Calloway had been awake inside that dark for the better part of 10 years. She did not light the lamp right away. She had learned somewhere in the second or third year of doing this alone that her hands knew the kitchen well enough to work without it. The tin cup on the left hook, the water bucket by the door, the fire laid the night before, waiting for a match. She moved through the dark the way water moves through a familiar channel, not thinking about it, not proud of it, simply doing it because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something Wren Calloway had ever been able to afford. The churn stood in the corner of the lean-to behind the kitchen where the temperature stayed coolest even in July. She had built the lean-to herself 3 years ago, salvaging planks from a collapsed fence along the north pasture line. It was not pretty. It was plumb and tight, and it kept the cream at the right temperature, which was the only thing that mattered. She pulled her sleeves to her elbows and began. The sound of a butter churn in the early morning is a particular sound. Not loud, not violent. A low rhythmic thudding, the kind of sound that settles into the body after a few minutes and becomes indistinguishable from the pulse. Wren had stopped hearing it consciously years ago. She heard it the way she heard her own breathing, only when she stopped. Her hands were 26 years old and looked older. The left palm carried a scar along the heel from a churn handle that had slipped in her second winter of doing this alone. The knuckles were thickened, the skin at the joints reddened in a way that did not entirely fade even in summer. She had stopped looking at them carefully a long time ago. They were not her hands for admiring. They were her hands for working, and they worked. In the clay pot by the kitchen window, a small glazed thing she had bought at the Harrow Creek market 3 years ago for a nickel, which had seemed like an extravagance at the time she kept her money. Every Saturday night after she came back from market, she counted what was in it. She knew the number before she counted. She counted anyway, the way a person checks a wound they already know is there, because not checking felt worse than the knowing. Last Saturday, the number had been $4.63. The doctor cost $2 a visit. B. Yarrow, who had treated the people of Harrow Creek for 30 years, came out to the Calloway place twice a year to look at Prue's hands and listen to her chest and adjust what she took for the swelling. That was $4 a year, not counting the medicine itself, not counting the coal for the fire that had to stay lit through the Colorado winters, not counting the rent on the acre, not counting food, not counting the small and constant incidentals that accumulated regardless of whether you could afford them. Wren did not run this arithmetic because it made her feel anything useful. She ran it because it was the only arithmetic there was, and knowing it exactly was the only form of control available to her. From the room at the back of the house on the other side of the thin plank wall, she could hear her grandmother breathing. Prue Calloway was 79 years old and had lived long enough to watch most of the things she loved either leave or be taken, and she had decided somewhere around her 65th year that the appropriate response to this was not grief but commentary. She had opinions about everything and kept none of them to herself. She had raised Wren from the age of 7 when the fever took Wren's parents within a week of each other, and she had done it without sentimentality and without complaint, which was the highest form of love Wren knew. Prue's hands had been swollen at the knuckles for 6 years now. She could not stand at the churn. She could not walk to the well. She could not do much of anything physical, and she had made her peace with this in the characteristically Prue fashion of pretending she had chosen it. She sat in her chair by the window from morning to evening and watched the road and the field and the 2 cows in the small pasture, and she missed nothing, and she told Wren everything she observed, and her eyes were as sharp as they had ever been. She needed feeding and tending, and the doctor twice a year, and a fire kept up, and medicine for the swelling, and a roof that did not leak, and she needed Wren. All of it had to come from somewhere. Where it came from was butter. Wren had 2 cows, a brindle named Taft and a red. She had never named, because naming the second one had felt like a commitment she wasn't certain she could sustain. She had a spring house dug into the cool bank of the creek below the lean-to, lined with flat stones she had carried up herself, 2 stones at a time over the course of a summer. She had her grandfather's butter mold, a carved wooden block that pressed a sheaf of wheat into the surface of every finished pound, worn smooth at the handle from 3 generations of use. And she had a gift. She did not think of it as a gift. She thought of it as the thing she knew how to do. But there is a difference between knowing how to do a thing and doing it the way Wren Calloway did it, and that difference showed up in the butter in ways that any serious palate could detect. She knew her cows the way a farmer knows land. She has worked for years. Their moods, their rhythms, the way the quality of the grass in the east corner of the pasture came through in the cream differently than the grass along the creek bank. She knew temperature the way a baker knows an oven by feel and by instinct rather than measurement, her wrist reading the coolness of the spring house the way some women read a room. She worked her butter free of every trace of buttermilk with a thoroughness that was closer to conviction than technique pressing and folding with the flat wooden paddle until the water ran clear, because buttermilk left in was the first thing that turned a good butter bad. And Wren Calloway did not make bad butter. She salted it with a hand so precise that the salt disappeared into a clean golden sweetness rather than announcing itself. And she pressed each finished pound into her grandfather's mold so that what came out of the spring house on Friday afternoons, packed in clean cheesecloth stacked on her handcart, looked like what it was. A small, careful thing made by someone who understood what she was making and why each step of making it mattered. She did not know it was remarkable. When you do a thing that well, and the world pays you the same thin price it pays for the worst butter at the market, you stop believing the thing is remarkable. You believe only that you are poor, which Wren was, and tired, which Wren also was, and overlooked, which was the truest of the 3. No man in Harrow Creek had ever looked at Wren Calloway as a woman worth pursuing. She understood why in the cold arithmetic of frontier life. She came with nothing, no land but the rented acre, no money, 2 cows, and a grandmother who would need tending until she died. A woman with a dependent and no dowry was the least courted creature on the Colorado frontier. She was all cost and no asset, and the young men of Harrow Creek were practical men who did their calculations plainly and looked elsewhere. She had stopped expecting otherwise sometime around her 22nd year. She had folded that part of herself away with the other things there was no money for, and she did not take it out and examine it because examining it would not change the numbers, and the numbers were what governed her life. She churned and she sold, and she tended Prue, and she counted the coins in the clay pot on Saturday nights, and she got up the next morning at 4 and started again. This was the life she had. She did not waste energy wanting a different one. The Saturday market in Harrow Creek ran along the main street from the hardware store to the feed merchant. A double row of carts and wagons and folding tables that drew the town and the surrounding farms together for a few hours of commerce and the specific social function that commerce serves in small places. The chance to see and be seen, to take the temperature of the community, to know that you are still part of something. Wren set up at the end of the row. She had set up at the end of the row for 6 years. It was not assigned to her. She had simply arrived early on her first Saturday and found the end spot unclaimed, and she had taken it, and no one had ever questioned it, and she had never thought to move closer to the center where the traffic was heavier. The end of the row was where she was, and she worked with what she had. She arranged her butter on the cart the way she always did, stacked in 2 rows, each pound wrapped in cheesecloth, the sheaf of wheat pressed clean and visible on top of each one. She had a small card she had written out years ago listing the price. She stood behind the cart with her hands at her sides and waited. The women of Harrow Creek bought butter the way they bought most things, on price and familiarity. They had their preferred sellers, most of them larger operations than Wren's. The men who ran those operations had 4 or 6 cows and hired hands and proper dairy sheds, and they had relationships with the town built over years of reliability and volume. Butter was butter as far as most of Harrow Creek was concerned. You spread it on bread and cooked with it, and if it was fresh enough, it didn't taste of much either way. Wren sold what she sold. Most Saturdays she did not sell all of it. She loaded what remained onto the cart and took it home and used it herself, or traded it to the Breck family to the north, who kept chickens and grew more potatoes than they could eat. The morning in June, when everything changed, began like every other Saturday morning. Warm already by 8 o'clock, the smell of horses and fresh-cut wood, and the bread someone was selling 3 stalls down. Wren standing behind her cart, with her hands at her sides, watching the market move without her. She noticed the man, the way she noticed most things, not with particular attention, but she logged it. He was someone she had not seen at the Harrow Creek market before, which meant either he was new to the area, or he was a man who sent others on market errands and had come himself today for a specific reason. He appeared to be around 40, she judged, tall enough that he had to angle slightly under the feed merchant's awning as he passed it. He was dressed well, but not expensively, the clothing of a man who bought good cloth and expected it to last a long time and treated it accordingly. He carried no basket. He moved along the butter row with a small folding knife and a particular deliberateness which told her he was a professional buyer who knew what he was looking for and was going about finding it systematically. He tasted from the first cart. Moved on. Second cart. A brief pause, a small adjustment of expression that might have been consideration or might have been nothing, and he moved on again. He was working down the row with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and was measuring against a clear internal standard. Wren watched him come. She was not nervous. She was never nervous at the market, or if she was, she had learned to keep it somewhere inside the body where it didn't show in the face or the hands. She stood as she always stood and waited. He reached her cart. He took a thin slice from the corner of the nearest pound with his folding knife, put it in his mouth, and then he stopped. Not the brief professional pause she had seen at the second cart. He stopped the way a man stops when something interrupts the current of his thinking entirely. His forward motion coming to a halt as if a hand had been placed on his chest. He stood with his knife in his hand and looked at nothing particular. And then he took another small slice from the same pound and tasted it again, more deliberately this time, with the focused attention of someone confirming a perception rather than forming one. The man at the next cart, Sid Pruitt, who sold a serviceable butter from a large herd, at a price that reliably undercut most of the row, glanced over. The man with the knife did not look at Sid Pruitt. He looked at Wren. "Who made this?" he said. His voice was quieter than she expected from a man his size. Not soft, there was nothing uncertain in it. It was simply a voice that did not use volume where directness would do. "I did," Wren said. She was already bracing inwardly for what usually followed a buyer stopping to ask who made something. In her experience, that question was the opening of a complaint or a negotiation, or both. "How long have you been making it this way?" he said. That was not the question she had expected. 10 years, she said, give or take. He looked at the cart, counted the pounds she had, looked back at her. "I'm Edmund Voss," he said. "I run Voss Hotel on the main street. I've been buying butter for my kitchen from Drum's Dairy since I opened the place 8 years ago." A pause in which he appeared to be finishing a thought, rather than waiting for her to speak. "I want to buy your whole cart." Wren looked at him steadily. All of it, and I'd want to arrange a standing order. Whatever you can produce each week, I'll take it. At a real price, not the market rate. A price that reflects what this actually is." "The market rate is the market rate," Wren said carefully. The words were not an objection exactly. They were a probe, a way of discovering what kind of man she was talking to. "The market rate," Edmund Voss said without heat and without condescension, in the manner of a man stating a verified fact, "is the price of ordinary butter. What is on this cart is not ordinary butter. I've been buying table butter for hotel dining rooms for 20 years across 3 different towns. What you have here is the finest I have put in my mouth in all of that time. I'd be ashamed to pay you what this row pays for the other product. It would be like buying a painting at the price of house paint." Wren said nothing. She waited for the part where this turned into something else, a haggle dressed up as a compliment, an offer that would deflate on contact. She waited because that was what her experience had trained her to wait for. It did not come. "Name me a price," he said. "An honest one based on what the work actually costs you, not the market figure, the real price of making it this well." She named a number. A third above the market rate, which felt as she said it like the most audacious claim she had made in any business exchange, and she kept her face composed while she waited for him to counter it downward. Edmund Voss said it was too low. He named a number higher than hers. He paid it from a leather billfold without ceremony, loaded her entire cart of butter into his own wagon with his own hands. Without asking for assistance, told her he would send word about the standing order arrangement. Tipped his hat in the general direction of no one in particular. The automatic courtesy of a man whose manners operated independently of his attention, and was gone. Wren walked home with an empty cart and a full purse for the first time in her working life. She made it halfway before she had to stop. There was a flat-topped stone beside the road where the path curved toward the creek, settled so deep into the ground that it had clearly chosen the spot long before anyone thought to build a road nearby. She sat on it and put her face in her hands and stayed there, not crying. She was not a person who came easily to crying, and this was not that kind of feeling in any case. It was something harder to name the specific sensation of a thing you had stopped believing was true, being confirmed as true by someone with nothing to gain from saying it. Edmund Voss had no reason to pay above market rate for her butter. He had done it because her butter was worth above market rate, and he was a man who paid what things were worth, and that was the whole of it. She had spent 10 years making something and being paid as if it were nothing. And a stranger with a folding knife had spent 30 seconds correcting that error without ceremony, without any apparent awareness that he had just dismantled something in her that years of discipline had been holding carefully shut. She sat on the stone for a while. Then she got up because Prue would want to know what had happened, and because the afternoon milking could not wait, and because sitting on stones in the middle of roads was a form of indulgence she had never before permitted herself and did not intend to make a habit of now. Prue was in her chair by the window when Wren came through the door, and she looked at Wren's face and at the empty cart, and she said, "Well, I sold all of it," Wren said. "I can see that." The sharp eyes moved from the cart to Wren's face and stayed there. "You look like you've had some kind of a shock." Wren set the purse on the table. Prue looked at it, looked back at her granddaughter. "Edmund Voss," Wren said, "from the hotel on the main street." Prue was quiet for a moment, which was not a state Prue inhabited often or comfortably. "He bought all of it." "All of it. He wants a standing order. Every week." Another silence. Prue looked out the window at the pasture where the red cow was standing at the fence line doing nothing in particular, and then she looked back at Wren. "All right," she said finally. "So now you'll need to make more." Which was the most Prue Calloway response available to the situation, and Wren laughed a short, surprised sound that she hadn't planned and went to start the afternoon milking. The standing order began the following Saturday. Wren had expected Edmund to send someone a boy from the hotel. A hired hand, anyone in the chain of people a hotel owner could reasonably dispatch on a supply errand. Instead, he arrived at the Calloway place himself at 7 in the morning in a light wagon, loaded the week's butter without asking for directions, paid without discussion, and stayed for 11 minutes before he had other business to attend to. 8 of those 11 minutes he spent in the kitchen doorway, talking to Prue, who had positioned herself there with what she would have described as accidental convenience and what Wren knew was deliberate placement. Prue had been in that exact spot since 10 minutes before Edmund was due. Prue assessed Edmund Voss in the way she assessed everything directly without apology and out loud to Wren, the moment his wagon had cleared the gate. "Widower," she said. "You can always tell. It's in the way they hold their shoulders, like they've been carrying something heavy for long enough that the carrying has become the posture. He's had several years of managing everything alone, and he doesn't complain about it, which means either he has no one to complain to or he's not a man who complains. Either way, that's useful information." She paused to consider. Good manners without being soft about them. That's rarer than it should be. I like it. "He is a customer," Wren said. "He is a man who drove out here himself when he could have sent any one of a dozen people." Prue said, "Don't perform stupidity, Wren. You have never been stupid, and this is not the time to start." Wren did not respond to this. She went back to the lean-to and started on the week's next batch. By the third week, Edmund Voss had settled into the habit of arriving a few minutes before the butter was ready to load, which meant there was always a period where he sat with Prue in the kitchen while Wren worked in the lean-to. She could hear them through the wall, Prue's voice carrying easily, as it always did Edmund's replies, quieter but audible, the comfortable rhythm of two people who had discovered they could speak to each other without waste. By the fourth week, he had begun coming down to the lean-to itself, not intrusively. He stood in the doorway well back from where she worked, his arms crossed and his expression the focused expression of a man paying close professional attention. He said when she acknowledged him, the first time that he believed in understanding the production process of things he served to guests. That knowing where quality originated helped him maintain it. Wren allowed that this made a reasonable kind of sense. She did not tell him to stop coming to the lean-to doorway. She noticed in the same careful noting she applied to other important facts that she didn't. He watched her work the paddle against the side of the churn, gathering the forming butter, and pressing the remaining liquid out in long, deliberate strokes. He watched her carry the finished mass to the flat rinsing stone, working cold creek water through it in slow, folding motions, until what came away was entirely clear. He watched her pack it into the mold and press the wheat sheaf into the top of each pound with the particular authority of someone who has performed a gesture so many times it has become a form of signature. Once in the fifth week, he said quietly, "I have eaten in dining rooms in Denver and Chicago that were not half as careful about what arrived on the table as you are about what goes into a single pound." "You're paying me to be careful," Wren said. "So I'm careful." He nodded as if she had said something worth considering and said nothing further, and she returned to the paddle. What Wren came to know about Edmund Voss, she assembled slowly in pieces. The way you understand a landscape you are moving through rather than one you are looking at from a fixed point. He had built Voss Hotel from a roadhouse 11 years ago, expanding it in deliberate stages, more rooms, then a proper dining room, then a kitchen with the capacity to serve the traffic of a growing territorial town. He had a reputation in Harrow Creek for being exacting and fair in that order, a man whose agreements were reliable and whose prices were honest. He did not participate in the social frictions of a small town because he lacked the time and found no value in it. His wife had died of a fever 5 years back. He had poured himself into the work afterward, which was what the grieving did when they had something worth pouring themselves into. He did not offer these details directly. Wren assembled them from the conversations she half heard through the lean-to wall, from things the townspeople mentioned in passing, from the particular way a man carries a loss that has had enough years to settle from an open wound into a permanent feature of the landscape of his life. The morning she understood something important about Edmund Voss, she had gone to deliver the week's order at Voss Hotel through the kitchen entrance rather than waiting for him at the Calloway place. She had a second errand in town that morning, and delivering first made the sequence more sensible. She came in through the alley door at the back of the kitchen and stopped because Edmund was at the far end of the kitchen in conversation with his head cook, a heavy-set, reliable man named Bertram who had been with the hotel since it opened. They had not heard her come in. Edmund was describing in the precise and economical language he brought to everything the specific qualities of the butter from the Calloway place. The temperature management of the spring house and what it accomplished with the cream. The particular technique she used in the final press and why it produced the texture it did. The salting, which she had never written down or measured in any way she had shared with anyone, and which he had apparently deduced accurately from observation and taste alone. Wren stood in the doorway and understood something. The man who had come to her cart on that first Saturday had not arrived by chance. He had not bought on impulse or sentiment. He had learned about the butter through some channel she was not fully aware of, had watched and listened, and verified the reputation against the product before he acted. He was a man who did not commit to things carelessly, who observed with patience before declaring something worth his attention, who paid what things were worth because he had done the prior work of understanding accurately what they were worth. She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she made enough noise with the crate to announce her presence, and he turned, and they exchanged the usual brief words about the order, and she left. She walked back along the main street of Harrow Creek in the late morning and thought for the first time in a long while about what it would mean to be understood by someone who had taken the trouble to look carefully before deciding. She folded the thought away, as she had folded other thoughts away. She was practiced at it, but she noticed walking home that this particular thought was more resistant to folding than most. The summer of 1875 moved the way Colorado summers do, bright and direct, in the days cool and clear at night, with afternoon thunderstorms that came off the mountains and passed in an hour, leaving the air scrubbed and the creek running fast. The pasture grass was good, and both cows were producing well, and Wren's butter had never been better. She was making more of it now, with the standing hotel order added to her market sales. She had extended her morning hours in the lean-to, starting earlier, finishing later. Her hands ached in the evenings in a way they hadn't at 22, and she kept them in warm water before bed, which helped some. But the clay pot by the window held more coins on Saturday nights than it ever had before, and the doctor's visit in May had been paid without the particular calculation that had previously attended it, and the coal merchant in town had stopped giving her the measuring look he used to give her when she came to settle her account. She did not permit herself to look too far ahead. She had learned through the kind of instruction that leaves no room for argument that looking too far ahead was a luxury she could not responsibly practice. There was this week and next week and the season, and that was the appropriate length of horizon. What she did not see coming was Silas Drum. Drum ran the largest dairy operation in the county. 40 cows, 2 hired men, a proper spring house, and a decade of established relationships with every hotel and boarding house in Harrow Creek. He had sold butter to Voss Hotel since Edmund opened the place. It was the best commercial account in the county. Steady volume, reliable payment, and the prestige of the best address in town anchoring his standing in the local trade. When Edmund Voss quietly transferred his entire hotel butter order to a girl with a handcart and 2 cows, Silas Drum lost the best account in the county. To 2 cows and a handcart, he found out in early July sideways through someone else's conversation in the way that makes the finding out compound the thing itself. He found out at the feed merchant's standing in line behind a man who mentioned casually that he'd eaten at Voss Hotel the previous week, and had there been a change in the butter, because it was something else entirely. Drum made inquiries. He found out that this new supplier was Wren Calloway from the rented acre east of town. 26 years old, 2 cows, a sick grandmother she was supporting alone. Had been selling at the end of the market row for 6 years without anyone taking particular notice of her. He could not make better butter. He had the cows and the equipment and the hired men, but he had never needed to care about quality the way a small producer had to care. Volume had always carried him. He had 40 cows. The girl had 2. There was no reasonable version of the world in which he should feel threatened by the girl with 2 cows. There were, however, other means of competing. The whisper started in the second week of July. It was not traceable to Drum directly, which was the nature of whispers. They move through a community by attaching themselves to existing channels of gossip and neighborly concern, shedding their origin as they travel. By the time a whisper has passed through 4 conversations, no one can name where it started, and this is precisely the mechanism that makes it effective. The whisper said that the spring house at the Calloway place was not as clean as a person might reasonably hope. It said that the old woman, the grandmother, the sick one, had some kind of condition that wasn't entirely clear and that you could never really know with a small operation what you were getting. It said these things gently in the tone of concerned neighborly anxiety rather than accusation, which is the most effective delivery for that kind of damage. Wren felt the whisper before she identified it as a whisper. A woman at the Saturday market who usually bought 2 pounds, buying one and not meeting her eyes. A man from the county land office who had always acknowledged her on the street, not acknowledging her one Thursday morning. A conversation at the dry goods store that paused when she came through the door and resumed at a different register once she had passed. She went home and scrubbed the spring house. She scrubbed it with cold water and hard soap until there was nothing in it that could have given the whisper a foothold on its worst day, until the stone walls shone and the shelves were bare and clean and the floor drained clear. And then she told anyone she encountered that they were welcome to come and see for themselves. Nobody came. That was the nature of whispers. You could not find them and refute them. You could not locate their source and prove it wrong in front of an audience. You could only watch them move through the community and feel them slowly eating the thing you had built, working in the dark where your hands couldn't reach, and know that you were being reduced by something you couldn't put your hands on. The coins in the clay pot on the Saturday night of the third week of July were the thinnest they had been since March, and it was the middle of summer when they should have been at their fattest. Wren sat at the kitchen table after counting them and looked at the lamp flame and listened to Prue breathing through the wall and held herself very still inside the numbers. She was not all right, but she got up the next morning at 4, as she always had, and went to the lean-to and began again, because there was nothing else to do, because stopping had never been an option she actually had. She had built this with her hands one morning at a time for 10 years. She was not going to let a whisper she couldn't catch take it from her without exhausting every other possibility first. That was where she stood at the end of the summer's first hard month, holding the line in the dark before 4 in the morning with the churn going and the creek running and the mountains holding the darkness in on all sides, waiting for the variable that would change. The brindle cow. Taft had a habit of pressing her forehead against the gate post in the early morning, not pushing against it, not trying to get through, just resting the full weight of her large head against the wood, the way a person leans a shoulder against a wall they trust to hold. Wren had noticed this for years without deciding what to make of it. She understood it in a way she couldn't articulate. The comfort of steady pressure against something solid. The particular usefulness of standing still against a fixed point when everything else in the world requires motion. She thought about Taft on the morning of the last Saturday in July when she loaded her cart with 11 pounds of butter down from the 22 she had brought to market 6 weeks earlier, and started the walk into Harrow Creek in the grey pre-dawn. 11 pounds. That was the number the whisper had reduced her to. She sat up at the end of the row, as she always had. She arranged her 11 pounds in their rows on the cart. She stood behind the cart with her hands at her sides and waited. And she watched the market fill around her, and she sold 4 pounds in 3 hours, and she loaded the remaining 7 onto the cart at noon, and took them home and said nothing about the number to Prue. Prue, of course, knew anyway. "How many?" she said from her chair. "Enough," Wren said. Prue looked at her with the eyes that missed nothing and did not press. She had a gift, that old woman, for knowing which silences to leave alone and which to enter. She left this one alone. That night, after Prue was asleep, Wren sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pencil stub and wrote the numbers down. Income on the left, costs on the right. The hotel order was holding. Edmund had not changed it, and she did not believe he would change it, but the market sales had been cut by more than half, and the market sales were what had allowed the hotel income to be something approaching sufficient rather than something approaching bare survival. She wrote the columns and looked at them. Then she wrote 2 words in the margin at the bottom of the right column, small as if smallness might reduce their meaning. County Poorhouse. She looked at those 2 words for a long time. Not as a fear was a feeling, and she had learned to move feelings to one side and think practically. She looked at them as a logistics question, what the poorhouse offered in practice. A room for Prue, a bed, meals and the doctor when needed. It was not nothing. In the cold accounting of a situation without better options, it was genuinely not nothing. She looked at the words until they stopped looking like words and started looking like the shape of a door she had not yet needed to open. Then she folded the paper in half, folded it again, and went to the wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She kept things there that she did not look at often, her mother's ring, a letter her father had written before the fever took him that she had never been able to read all the way through, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of old flannel, her grandfather's butter mold. She placed the folded paper beneath the mold, closed the lid, and went back to the kitchen. She did not cry. She had not cried since she was 19, had cried then about something else, and had decided afterward that it had not helped, and she would not practice it. She went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to Prue breathe through the wall, and when 4 o'clock came, she got up and went to the lean-to and began. The idea arrived on a Tuesday in the way that useful ideas tend to arrive not through advice or instruction, but through the accumulation of small observations that finally reached a weight where they tipped into something she could act on. She had been at the post office on Monday, paying the postage on a letter to a feed merchant in Pueblo about hay prices, and while she waited for the clerk to sort the mail, she had looked at the notices board beside the window. She looked at it without really looking the way you look at a wall you have passed many times. But one notice had caught enough of her attention that she carried it home in her head without entirely meaning to. Harrow Creek County Fair, 3rd week of September. Livestock produce and trades competition, butter and dairy. Judging blind evaluation by a panel of 3 judges from Jefferson, Fremont, and Pueblo counties. Entries to be submitted under sealed number only. Maker's identity not to be revealed until after judging is complete and recorded. Blind evaluation. 3 judges from outside the county. Sealed numbers. She had stood in the kitchen with her coat still on and let this information settle. It meant that Silas Drum's name and his 40 cows and his 10-year standing in Harrow Creek would have no weight whatsoever in that judging room. It meant that the whisper he had set loose in the community would have no purchase in the mouths of strangers from Jefferson and Fremont and Pueblo who had never heard of Wren Calloway or Silas Drum and would have no opinion of either, except insofar as what was placed before them tasted the way butter ought to taste. She thought about it for a day and a half. She turned it over and examined it from the angles she could find. And on Tuesday morning, instead of waiting for Edmund to come to her as he did every Saturday, she put on her good coat and walked into town and went to Voss Hotel. Edmund was in the small office behind the front desk. He looked up from his papers as she was shown in with the expression of a man who had not expected her, but was not surprised. "Miss Calloway," he said. He stood as he always did when she entered a room. She had noted this in the first week and not commented on it, and he had never drawn attention to it. It simply happened. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "Sit down," he said. They sat. She told him about the county fair, about the blind judging about the panel from outside. She said it without preamble because she had found over the years that preamble usually served the speaker's nerves more than the listener's understanding, and she was not interested in serving her nerves. He listened without interrupting. This was a thing she had come to count on about him. He listened with his full attention without the forward lean of a man who is waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, she said, "I think I should enter. If the judging is genuinely blind, it will come out the way it should. And I think that's the only way to address what Drum has done, because you can't argue with a sealed number. I wanted to know whether you thought I was right about that, or if there's something I'm not seeing." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man deciding what to say, but the silence of a man who is already certain and is letting the certainty arrive before he speaks it. "You're not missing anything," he said. "A whisper can beat you at the Saturday market because the Saturday market runs on reputation and feeling. It cannot beat you in a blind judging in front of 3 strangers from 3 other counties. There is no rumor in a man's mouth when he doesn't know whose butter he is tasting. There is only the butter." "That is what I thought," Wren said. "Drum will enter," Edmund said. "His pride will not allow otherwise. He has won this judging 3 of the last 5 years. He will expect to win it again." "Good," Wren said. "Let him enter." Edmund looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was the face of a man who was closer to one than he usually came. "You have 2 months," he said. "That is time enough." "I know it is," Wren said. She stood. He walked her to the hotel's front door, which was farther than necessary, and both of them understood that it was. And he held the door, and she went through it, and she walked back down the main street in the morning sun, feeling something she had not felt in the weeks since the whisper began. Not hope, exactly. Something more practical and more durable than hope. The feeling of a problem that had seemed formless and uncatchable suddenly having to find edges. Something she could measure. Something she could plan around and work toward. She had always been better with problems that had edges. There was something Edmund Voss knew that he did not tell Wren Calloway in his hotel office that Tuesday morning, and the decision not to tell her was deliberate and carefully made. He had a contact in the dairy trade in Denver, a man named Gifford who had spent 20 years buying and selling cream and butter across the territory, and knew where every reputation in the business had originated and what it was actually constructed on. Edmund had written to Gifford in July when the whisper about Wren's spring house first reached him, because Edmund was a man who, when confronted with a situation he did not fully understand, gathered information until he did. Gifford's reply had arrived in 10 days. It confirmed what Edmund had been unable to verify on his own. Silas Drum had been adulterating his butter for at least 4 years. Not dramatically, not in a way that made it dangerous or immediately obvious to anyone who was not paying close and informed attention. But Drum had been incorporating rendered lard into his batches, a small enough percentage to avoid detection by an ordinary buyer, sufficient to increase the finished weight, and salting more heavily than good butter required, because salt in excess was an effective way to mask the flavor shift that lard introduced. It was a practice that existed at the margins of several large operations that had grown too established to feel pressure to maintain quality and too prominent to fear that anyone would investigate them. Edmund had sat with Gifford's letter and thought about what to do with it. He could act on the information directly. He could take it to the county fair committee or to the territorial authorities, or simply introduce it into the channels where such things moved efficiently in a small town. It would accomplish by a more direct route what he wanted to see accomplished. Drum discredited Wren's reputation, restored the whisper, killed at the source. But it would be his accomplishment, not hers. He had watched her work. He had stood in the lean-to doorway and observed her hands moving over the churn and the paddle and the mold with the specific confidence of someone who has mastered something real and does not need to perform that mastery for an audience. He had watched her price her own work too low and accept a correction without deflating, which was the mark of a person who understands value without being dependent on external confirmation to sustain that understanding. He had watched her stand behind her cart at the end of the market row week after week and not move closer to where the traffic was heavier. She had built something genuine. What was being done to it was a specific kind of injustice, the kind that targets the unprotected precisely because they appear to have no recourse. And the correction of that injustice needed to be as genuine as what she had built. It needed to come from the work itself in front of people with no stake in the outcome, witnessed publicly and recorded permanently. The letter from Gifford would surface on its own if the judging went as Edmund believed it would. A blind panel experienced enough to evaluate dairy products properly would detect the adulteration in Drum's butter without Edmund needing to say a word. The notation would go into the county's public record. The facts would stand on their own, which was the only way facts stood that couldn't later be called into question. He put the letter in his desk drawer, locked it, and did not revisit the decision. What he did instead was send word to Wren the following week that he needed to increase the hotel order by half again for the rest of the summer. September brought more travelers through than August, which was true, and the hotel's dining room had been growing in reputation, which was also true, and did not mention that the doubling would give her 6 weeks of working at full productive capacity before the fair, which meant the butter she brought to the judging in September would be the product of 6 weeks of her best effort at the highest demand she had ever worked to meet. He told her what was true and did not tell her everything, which was a different thing from lying, and he understood the difference clearly. Wren took the increased order, went home, and did the work. The 6 weeks before the Harrow Creek County Fair were the most demanding of Wren's working life, and they were also in some ways she could not entirely account for the most purposeful. She was up at 3:30 now instead of 4. She had rearranged the lean-to to improve the airflow around the churns, a small structural change that produced a measurable improvement in temperature consistency throughout the longer working hours. She had spent 2 evenings at the creek below the spring house, moving stones, redirecting the coldest flow closer to the storage shelves. None of these were new ideas. They were refinements of things she already knew applied with a precision she had never previously allowed herself, because previously she had been producing butter for a market that would not pay for that level of precision. And precision applied where there was no return on it was waste. Now she was producing butter for a blind, judging by 3 strangers from 3 counties, and precision was exactly what the situation called for and what the expanded order could support. She worked in the early morning dark with a quality of attention that she recognized even as she was inside it as different from her ordinary working attention. It was the attention of someone doing a thing not because they must, but because they have decided it is worth doing entirely and correctly. The work felt different as a result. Not lighter, it was heavier than it had ever been. More hours, more cold water, more sustained physical effort. But different in the way that a burden feels different from a purpose, even when the physical weight is the same. Prue, who was in the room on the other side of the lean-to wall through most of these mornings, developed the habit of calling through the wall at intervals. Not to check on anything that needed checking, to be present in the way that was available to her. "Salt yet?" she would call. "Not yet." Wren would answer. A silence. "Don't rush it." "I never rush it." "I know that. I'm saying it anyway." This exchange, in some variation, happened almost every morning for 6 weeks. It was in its particular way the most sustained conversation they had managed in years, a few words through a plank wall about butter in the dark before dawn. Wren found that she counted on it. The sound of her grandmother's voice through the wall, not because anything required checking, but because Prue wanted Wren to know she was still there on the other side of it. It was a specific form of love. It did not announce itself or seek acknowledgement. It simply persisted. Wren understood this kind of love better than any other. The 2nd week of August, with terrible and precise timing, Prue got sick, not dangerously at first. A cough that started on a Monday and had deepened significantly by Wednesday, combined with a fever that came in waves high in the evenings and lower in the mornings. The window she kept cracked open even in summer had to close because of the cold nights, and the closed window made the room close and warm. And the warmth made the cough worse, and the cough kept her from sleeping, and the lost sleep drove the fever higher. Dr. Yarrow came out Thursday and listened to Prue's chest with the wooden cone she had used for 30 years and prescribed a bottle of syrup and a tincture for the fever, and complete rest and a warm room kept consistently warm and no exertion. The visit cost $2. The medicine cost $1.25 more. Wren paid it from the clay pot. She sat in the kitchen that evening after Prue had taken the first dose and fallen into a shivering sleep, and she looked at what remained in the pot. She did not get the paper out. She ran the arithmetic in her head because she knew the numbers with enough precision that writing them down would not change what they said. The hotel income was holding. The fare was 5 weeks away. If Prue's illness ran longer than 2 weeks, if it required a second doctor visit. If the medicine needed replenishing before it had run its course, the arithmetic moved from difficult into a category she did not have a word for. That was more specific than impossible. She sat with the lamp burning low and thought about impossible problems and what practically you did with them. What you did was continue. Not because continuing solved the impossible problem, because stopping solved it worse, and continuing kept the variables in motion, and in motion occasionally a variable shifted. She went to check on Prue. Prue was partially awake, her eyes tracking Wren's movement across the room with the slow focus of someone whose fever had taken the edge off the usual sharpness, but had not eliminated the attention behind it. "Sit," Prue said. Her voice was rough, scraped by the cough. Wren sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm not dying," Prue said. "I know," Wren said. "I can hear you thinking from here. It's too loud." "I'm not thinking anything particular." "You're thinking the particular thing you always think when things get tight." "I know the sound of it." Prue's hand, swollen at the knuckles, found Wren's on the quilt and held it with more strength than it usually had. "I've been sick before." "I know you have." "And I'm still here." "Yes," Wren said. "You are." "Then stop calculating," Prue said. "It's not helping either of us." Wren looked at her grandmother's face, 79 years of weather and work and stubbornness and love all present. At once the eyes going soft with exhaustion, but still even now missing nothing, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "All right," she said. Prue's eyes closed. Wren sat on the edge of the bed until the old woman's breathing settled into the deeper, slower rhythm of genuine sleep. Then she went back to the kitchen and banked the fire for the night and did not think about the arithmetic as instructed. She was not entirely successful, but she was more successful than she would have been without the instruction, which was Prue's particular talent, not solving problems, but naming the ones that weren't worth making worse by the solving. By the third week of August, Prue was upright in her chair by the window again. She was pale and thinner and tired in a way that showed around her eyes, but she was upright and commenting on the road with the same editorial specificity she always had, which was Prue's own benchmark for having recovered sufficiently. The medicine had been enough. The doctor had come only the once. The arithmetic had remained barely and without room to spare within the range of the possible. Edmund came that Saturday and spent 20 minutes with Prue in the kitchen, telling her the hotel gossip, the traveling salesman who had claimed to be a senator and been quietly disproved by the man himself. The rancher from Fremont County, who had sent his steak back 3 times and then ordered a second one with the precise dry delivery of a man who notices the humor in things without needing to signal that he has noticed it. Prue laughed twice. Real laughs, the kind that shook her shoulders and had sound in them. Wren heard it from the lean-to and kept her hands moving and let the sound do what it did. When Edmund came to the lean-to doorway that Saturday, he said only, "She sounds better." "She is," Wren said. "Good." He watched her work for a moment. 5 weeks to the fair. "I know. How is the batch coming?" Wren considered the question with the seriousness it was owed, turning the paddle once in her hands, looking at the butter gathering on the side of the churn with the particular color and consistency she had been working toward for 6 weeks. "It's the best I've made," she said. She said it as a technical assessment with neither pride nor apology, the way she said things that were simply accurate. Edmund looked at the churn. "Then let it be what it is," he said. "Don't improve it past itself. When a thing is right, it's right." "I know when to stop," she said. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know you do." He left, as he always left, without ceremony. She heard his boots on the path, and then Prue's voice through the wall beginning some new observation about the state of the road, and she returned to the paddle and the churn. Slow folding work of pressing something already good towards something better still. The last days of August arrived cool, which was unusual for Colorado at that altitude, and was generally read as a sign of an early fall. The aspens on the upper slopes had already begun to turn the green going yellow at the leaf tips working inward. The creek ran lower. The light angled differently, the particular late summer angle that contains within it the information that something is ending and something else will follow, and that the interval between these two facts is shorter than it was. Wren made the batch for the county fair in the 3rd week of September, 3 days before the competition. She began at midnight and worked through to dawn, moving through the stages with a quality of care she recognized as different from any she had brought to the work before. Not more careful, she was always careful, but with a different relationship to the care, as if the work and the caring about the work had become over the 6 weeks of preparation the same thing. She took the cream temperature with the back of her wrist at intervals. She worked the paddle in long, even strokes that built the butter slowly, without overworking the structure of it. She rinsed it in the coldest water the creek offered at that hour, the water from the deepest channel below the spring house, cold enough that her hands went past aching into a kind of numbness that she had learned to work through rather than stop for. She pressed each pound into her grandfather's mold. The wheat sheaf worn smooth at the handle, but still sharp enough in its carved lines to press a clear impression. She wrapped each pound in clean white cheesecloth and stacked them on the lowest shelf of the spring house, where the cold was most reliable. And then she sat on the step of the spring house in the early morning with her hands open in her lap and watched the sky above the ridge go from black to deep blue to the particular pale gray that comes just before the first actual light. She was not certain she would win. She was not in the habit of certainty about outcomes she could not fully control. She was certain that the butter was the best she had ever made. She was certain that it was the honest product of 10 years of early mornings and cold water and the specific discipline of someone who had cared about a thing enough to do it exactly right, even when no one was watching and there was no reward for the precision except the precision itself. That was what she was bringing to the judging. The thing itself made as well as she could make it. She had always believed in the part of herself she had kept most carefully closed, that this ought to be enough, that doing something genuinely well ought to be recognized for what it was. She had not allowed herself to act on that belief because the world had not consistently supported it. She allowed it now, sitting on the cold stone step in the September dark, with the mountains beginning to show their edges against the lightning ski. She believed it with the particular conviction of someone who has earned the right to it through the years of not quite believing it that came before. She got up when the sun cleared the ridge, went in to build the fire, made the coffee, listened to Prue begin to move in the back room. 3 days. The morning of the Harrow Creek County Fair came cold and clear. The kind of September morning that Colorado produces when it has decided to demonstrate what it can do with a sky. The blue above the ridge was deep and still scrubbed clean by the first genuine cold of the season, a blue that looked permanent. The aspens on the upper slopes had gone fully yellow. The creek caught the early light and returned it in broken pieces. The air smelled of pine and cold, and something that had no name but meant autumn. Wren was up at 3, not because the butter needed anything further. The butter was done packed and wrapped and waiting in the spring house on the lowest shelf. She was up because she had not slept meaningfully past 2 o'clock, and lying in the dark, tracking her own thoughts had become less useful than rising and doing something with her hands. She made coffee. She built the fire higher than the morning required because the cold had come in hard overnight and the house held it in the walls until the fire had been going for an hour. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around the cup and looked at the lamp and listened to Prue breathing through the wall, steady and even. The breathing of someone who had been sick and had come through it sleeping the deep, rebuilding sleep of recovery. Wren sat with that sound and let it settle her the way it always had, the ongoing, unconditional fact of her grandmother still being alive and breathing on the other side of the wall. She had done everything she could do. The work was finished. What happened today would happen independently of anything further she could do to affect it. 3 judges from 3 counties would taste what was placed before them and record what they found. That was the whole of it. She had spent her entire adult life in conditions she could not fully govern, and necessity had taught her not gently but thoroughly to identify the precise boundary between what she could affect and what she couldn't, and to apply her energy only on the right side of that line. The butter was on the other side now. It was done. She drank her coffee in the dark kitchen and waited for the morning. Prue appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30, which was later than her usual hour, and told Wren something about how the recovery was still underway, though Prue would not say so directly, and Wren would not press her on it. She came to the doorway in her robe with her hair not yet pinned, which was also unusual, and stood there with her sharp eyes doing their accounting of the room and of Wren in it. "You slept," she said. "Some," Wren said. "Better than none." Prue moved carefully to her chair by the window, settling with the deliberate patience of someone whose joints require negotiation each morning, but who has decided this will not be mentioned. She looked out at the road, grey and still in the pre-dawn, then back at Wren. "I want to go." "I know. I am well enough." "I know that too." "Then don't make it a discussion," Prue said. "Get the chair." The rolling chair had been lent to them 8 months ago by the Breck family, a narrow wooden thing with small iron wheels that managed smooth ground adequately and complained loudly over anything else. The road into Harrow Creek was packed dirt and mostly flat. The fairgrounds were on the east field beyond the livery stable, and the ground out there would be uneven in places. Wren looked at her grandmother, 79 years old and still recovering, sitting in her chair by the window in the early morning with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the practical matters to be resolved. "All right," Wren said. "We'll go." They left at 7. Wren pushed the chair with one hand and pulled the small cart with the butter with the other, which required working out the geometry of the arrangement before they reached the first bend in the road. She had packed 8 pounds for the competition the rules allowed up to 10, and had selected 4 from those 8 for the actual entry, the 4 most consistent in color, texture, and salt balance. She had not told anyone she was entering. Not Edmund, not the Breck family. No one. This had been a deliberate choice, thought through carefully. Not because she was secretive by nature, though she was private, but she had wanted the act of entering to belong entirely to her, uncomplicated by anyone else's expectations or investment in the outcome. If she won, it would be her win earned in front of strangers who knew nothing about her. If she lost, it would be her loss, and she would understand what it meant and decide what to do next. She did not want the weight of someone else's hope threaded through the morning. Edmund would be at the fair. He went every year. He would see her there. She thought he would understand when the time came why she had not told him. He was a man who understood things without requiring them to be explained at length. The fairgrounds were already filling when Wren and Prue arrived at 7:30. Wagons along the fence line, the smell of roasting corn and animals and fresh-cut hay. Children moving at the speed children move when they have been released into an open space with interesting things in every direction. Serious-faced men in good hats examining cattle in the pen along the north end with the concentrated attention of buyers who have come a distance to be here. The competition hall stood at the center of the grounds. A long wooden building, newer than most of the structures around it, built with county money the previous year. Inside, long tables ran down each wall, preserves and produce on the left, grain and milled goods on the right, dairy and specialty at the back. The dairy table was staffed by a young woman with a ledger who collected entries and assigned them numbers. Wren set her £4 on the table and gave her name. "Number 9, the young woman said, and wrote it in the ledger and handed Wren a small card with the number on it. "Judges start at 10. Results at 2 o'clock. "Thank you," Wren said. She looked at her butter on the table. 4 pounds in clean white cheesecloth, the wheat sheaf pressed clean and clear on each, the color a deep, even gold. It sat among 20 other entries from across the county, each numbered, each anonymous. She looked at it for a moment, not with sentiment, not with doubt. Simply looking at it the way you look at work you have finished and know is what you intended it to be. Then she turned and went back out to where she had left Prue near the entrance. "Done," Prue said. "Done," Wren said. "Good." Prue looked around the fairgrounds with the expression of someone who has been indoors too long and intends to remedy this comprehensively. "Take me to see the horses. They spent the morning at the fair." Wren pushed the chair, and Prue commented on everything within her line of sight with the freedom of a woman who has earned the right to say exactly what she thinks and sees no reason to withhold it. The horses were strong this year. The raspberry jam entries on the preserves table all looked essentially identical. The early corn suggested either a good summer or a concerning fall, depending on your perspective and who you listened to. Wren pushed the chair and let Prue talk and breathe the cold September air and kept her attention on the morning itself rather than on the building at the center of the grounds where her butter sat on a table waiting for strangers. She saw Edmund at 9:30 near the livestock pens in conversation with a rancher she didn't recognize, a man in a broad hat who had the look of someone who had come from a distance and was discussing something specific. Edmund saw her at the same moment across the moving crowd with the directness of a man who had been aware of her general location without making it apparent. He excused himself and came over. He looked at Prue in the rolling chair, Prue, who looked back at him with the expression she reserved for people she had fully approved of, and then at Wren. "You entered," he said. "This morning." "What number?" 9. He nodded once without comment on what that meant to him or what he thought of it. He did not say good luck or you'll do well. He looked at her with the steady attention he gave to things he took seriously and said, "What time are the results?" 2 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. He greeted Prue, who received him warmly in the manner of someone who has made a decision about a person and sees no advantage in being subtle about it. They talked for a few minutes, Prue asking pointed questions about recent hotel guests, Edmund answering with the dry, unhurried wit he reserved for conversations he was genuinely enjoying. Wren stood beside the rolling chair and listened with part of her attention and looked at the mountains above the tree line with the rest. Then Edmund returned to his rancher, and Wren took Prue in search of something warm to eat, and the morning continued. At 10 o'clock, the 3 judges entered the competition hall through the side door. Wren was not inside when they came in. She had decided after thinking it through that she would not watch the judging. She had no ability to affect it, and watching would serve her anxiety more than her preparation. She took Prue to the far end of the fairgrounds near the baked goods and found two old men playing fiddle near the fence and sat on a hay bale in the thin September sun and let the music occupy the part of her attention that would otherwise have been running numbers. Prue sat in her rolling chair beside the hay bale and said nothing. This was significant. Prue, in genuine silence, was Prue paying the highest form of attention available to her, the silence she used when she understood that a person needed to exist in their own moment without assistance or commentary. The fiddles played something slow, and then something quick, and then slow again. The fair continued around them. The sun moved in its low fall arc across the blue sky. At 1:45, Wren stood. "Time," Prue said. "Almost," Wren said. "Same thing," Prue said. She straightened in her chair and smoothed her skirt with her swollen hands. "Push me in close. I want to see everything." The competition hall had filled while they were at the far end of the grounds. Word had moved through the fairgrounds in the way it moves in small communities, not through announcement, but through the particular current of attention that a community generates when something worth witnessing is approaching. People had come in from the livestock pens and the produce tables and the baked goods displays, filling the space between the judging tables and the far wall until the room held as many people as it could comfortably manage, and a few more. Silas Drum was positioned near the front. He stood with two of his hired men and two of the better-dressed members of the County Commerce Committee, the company of a man who expects to receive something and wants witnesses of appropriate standing present when he does. He was not looking at the judging table. He was looking at the door, the expression of a man at an occasion he is confident will resolve in his favor. He did not see Wren come in, or if he noticed her, he assigned her no significance. She was from his perspective a girl with a handcart and a sick grandmother, a minor problem he had addressed, and that was no longer worth particular attention. Wren positioned Prue's chair near the side wall where the sight line to the judging table was clear, and the crowd was not so dense that the chair would create difficulty. She stood behind the chair with her hands on the handles and looked at the front of the room. The three judges were seated behind the long table. The man in the center introduced to the crowd when the judging began as the head of the panel. A dairy buyer from Pueblo named Pharaoh, who had worked in the trade for 3 decades, had a broad, plain, unhurried face and the careful, precise eyes of someone who has spent years developing a specific expertise and respects what that expertise has cost him. To his left and right, the other 2 judges, similar in their quiet professionalism, men who had come here to do a particular job accurately and without theater. The entries were arranged before them on the table, numbered each one on a square of clean white cloth. Anonymous. Equal in every respect that the surface allowed. Wren could see number 9 from where she stood. She looked at it once. Then she looked at Pharaoh. The judging was methodical. Pharaoh worked from left to right, each judge tasting in sequence, brief conferral between them, marks entered in the ledger the young woman carried behind the panel. Most entries received a nod, a mark, a movement forward. 2 received longer consideration. The judges returning to them, tasting again the discussion, running several more sentences before the marks were made. The room held a genuine quiet, the quiet of people paying attention to something because it interests them, not because they have been asked to be silent. Pharaoh reached number 9. He took a thin slice with the flat-bladed tasting knife and placed it on his tongue, and he went still. The stillness lasted no longer than 3 seconds, but it was a distinctly different quality of stillness from what he had brought to any other entry. Something changed in the set of his face. He looked at the entry directly, not at his colleagues, for a moment. Then he cut a slightly larger slice and tasted it again with the focused deliberateness of a man confirming a perception he does not want to misreport. He said something quiet to the judge on his left. The judge on his left tasted. His expression changed. The judge on the right. All 3 of them, with the entry now tasting in sequence, conferring in the low professional voices of people who are trying to be accurate rather than dramatic. The room had been quiet before. Now it shifted into a different kind of quiet. The silence of a crowd that has seen something happen and is waiting to understand what it means. Pharaoh set his knife down. He did not move to number 10. He looked up at the room, and when he spoke he did not raise his voice, but the room was still enough that his words carried clearly to the walls. I have judged dairy competitions in this territory for 30 years, he said. He was not a man who used preamble, and this was not preamble. I have evaluated butter in this county, and in 4 others, and in the city of Denver. What is in front of me at position 9 is the finest table butter I have put in my mouth in all of that time. He paused in the manner of a man who is being precise rather than dramatic. It is clean, and it is sweet, and it will keep. The salting is exact. The working is thorough, without being overdone. This is a maker's butter, made by someone who understands what they are making at every stage of the process. He looked at the young woman with the ledger. When the results are announced, he said, I would like to shake the hand of whoever made number 9. The room released its breath in a collective involuntary sound. Near the front, Wren saw Silas Drum's posture change. A small change, a slight adjustment of the shoulders, a tightening around the jaw. The recalibration of a man whose certainty about an outcome has just been interrupted by information he did not anticipate. Pharaoh and his colleagues conferred briefly. Marks were made. The judging continued through the remaining entries. The crowd did not entirely settle again after Pharaoh's words. There was a current in it now, a low sustained hum of anticipation running toward 2 o'clock. When the last entry had been tasted and the final marks recorded, Pharaoh set his knife down for the last time, and the young woman with the ledger stepped to the center of the table. The results were read in order from last to first. Wren stood behind Prue's chair with her hands on the handles and listened to the numbers. She did not move. She did not look at Drum. She looked at the young woman and listened. The reading moved through the entries. The crowd grew quieter with each placement called the anticipation tightening by degrees. The young woman reached the final result. First place by unanimous decision of the panel. She paused. Number 9. 1 full second of silence. Then the seal was broken on the card beside number 9, and the young woman read the name written on it. Wren Calloway of Harrow Creek. The sound that moved through the room was not loud and not dramatic. It was the sound of a community processing information murmurs, turning heads, the specific spreading ripple of recognition that moves through a crowd when a name arrives in a context that rearranges what people thought they knew. From the rolling chair, Prue made a sound. Not words. A low, fierce, private sound, and Wren felt the slight shaking of the chair through her hands on the handles. Pharaoh came around the table and extended his hand to Wren, and she shook it, and he said again, plainly that he had meant every word, that it was the finest table butter he had encountered in 30 years of evaluating dairy products in this territory, and that whoever had taught her had given her something worth having. And if no one had taught her, and she had arrived at it on her own, that was more remarkable still. She thanked him. Her voice was level. Her hands were not entirely steady. The young woman with the ledger continued reading the complete results for the record, including the panel's notations on each entry. When she reached second to last, she read the entry number, and then because all maker names were released once judging was complete, she read the name beside it and the note the judges had entered. Entry 14. Drum Dairy Silas Drum Proprietor. A brief pause as she read the notation. Panel notation evidence of lard adulteration and excessive salting detected. Entry does not meet fair competition standards for pure dairy product. Noted for county record. The silence that followed this was of an entirely different quality from the silence that had followed Wren's name. It was the silence of a room full of people receiving information that confirms something they had perhaps half suspected or half known, but had never had reason or occasion to say publicly. The silence of a truth arriving in a form that made private dismissal impossible. Silas Drum stood near the front of the room and did not move. The hired men beside him looked at each other. The men from the County Commerce Committee discovered a point of interest on the far wall. Wren did not look at Drum. She was looking at Prue. Prue was looking back at her from the rolling chair with eyes that were bright and dark. At the same time, the eyes of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that the world does not always correct the wrongs it permits, but that when it does correct them, the correction tends to arrive exactly like this. Publicly, plainly, before the whole community, with no mechanism for revision or appeal. The county official, named Prewitt from the land office, the man who had come to Edmund in July to ask whether Voss Hotel ought to reconsider its dairy supply, made his way through the crowd to where Wren stood. He extended his hand. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Congratulations." She looked at his hand. She shook it. "I appreciate that," she said. She said it without warmth and without irony, at exactly the temperature of someone accepting what is owed, without extending more credit than is owed. Prewitt appeared to understand this. He nodded and moved on. From her chair at a volume calibrated to reach the people nearest her and several beyond them, Prue said, "Took long enough." Several people laughed. The laughter moved through the room and released what remained of the tension the way a small opening in a dam releases pressure, not everything at once, but enough. People began to talk to move the normal noise of the fair reasserting itself around the edges of what had happened. Edmund Voss found her 20 minutes later. She had moved to the side of the room, slightly apart from the cluster of people that had formed near the judging table. She was watching Prue hold court. From the rolling chair, 3 women from the town had gathered around her grandmother, and Prue was telling them something that was making all 3 of them laugh at once. Wren was watching this and thinking that whatever else happened today, Prue had gotten what she had come for, and that was something. Edmund came and stood beside her. He did not say congratulations. He looked at Prue and the 3 women for a moment. Then he said, "I knew." Wren turned to look at him. "Not the number," he said. "I didn't know it would be 9, but I knew what they would find when they got to yours. I have known since the first Saturday in June." He paused. "There is something else I should tell you." She waited. "I knew about Drum," he said. He said it looking at Prue rather than at her, which was the manner of a man who is being honest about something and wants to give the honesty room to be received properly. "About the lard. I had it confirmed in a letter from a man in Denver who has been in the trade for 20 years and knows where every reputation is built and what it actually rests on. I knew in July." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't tell you. I didn't go to the fair committee. I didn't act on it at all." Wren said nothing. She was thinking about July, about the clay pot getting thin, about the paper she had folded and put in the chest under the butter mold, about Prue's fever coming in at exactly the worst moment, the way bad things have a particular gift for timing. "You could have ended it faster," she said. The words were level, but there was something beneath them that was not entirely level, and she did not try to conceal it. "Yes," he said. He did not flinch from it. "I could have." She looked at the mountains through the high window of the competition hall, the yellow aspens just visible on the upper slopes. "Those were hard months," she said. "I know they were," he said. "I know." A silence between them. Not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people being honest with each other about something that cost something and not rushing past it. "If you had ended it," she said finally, "it would have been over." She looked at him. "But it would have been your ending, and I would have known that for the rest of my life. I would have known that when the moment came, someone else resolved it for me." He nodded. He did not say that he had been right to wait, because he understood that was not what she was saying and not what she needed from him. "I'm sorry it was hard," he said. "It was," she said, "and I won." She looked at the blue ribbon the young woman had pinned to the cheesecloth beside her entry on the table. She had not let herself look at it directly since it was placed. There had been afraid that looking too directly would make it feel less real. She looked at it now. A blue ribbon at a county fair in Colorado Territory in the fall of 1875 was not a large thing in the accounting of the world, but it was what she had the product of 10 years of early mornings in cold water and a particular discipline that she had maintained even when maintaining it had seemed unsustainable. And it was public, and it was in the county record, and the notation beside Silas Drum's name would not be removed. Edmund Voss crossed the room to the judging table and bought every pound of butter she had entered the blue ribbon still pinned to the cheesecloth as it was and as it should remain. He stacked the 4 wrapped pounds under one arm, as if they were the natural conclusion of an errand he had meant to run all along, and he came back to where she stood. He took off his hat. He was a tall man, and without the hat he was somehow more present. The height, more apparent, the lines of his face fully visible, the grey at his temples that caught the light from the hall's high windows. He was not a romantic figure. He was a man who had built something from very little and buried his wife and kept working and had been lonely in the specific way of competent people who have managed without help for long enough that the managing has become the habit. He was not the kind of man who said things he didn't mean, which meant that when he spoke what he had to say, the weight of it was the weight of someone who meant every word. He stood in front of her and held his hat in one hand and her butter in the crook of his other arm and said what he had come to say. "I bought your whole cart the first Saturday because it was the finest butter I had tasted in 20 years of buying it for hotel dining rooms," he said. "That was the reason I came to your cart. It was not the reason I kept coming." He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I kept coming because I wanted to. Because I found in your grandmother a woman worth spending time with, and in your work a kind of integrity I have not often encountered. And in you a person I wanted to know better than a butter transaction allowed. I drove out to your place every Saturday morning when I could have sent any of 3 men in my employ, and I drove out because I had exhausted the good reasons for not doing so." He paused, not for effect, because what came next required its own space. "I am not asking for your butter anymore, Miss Calloway. Voss Hotel will buy every pound you will ever make at whatever price you name for as long as either of us draws breath. But that is a business arrangement, and this is a different question entirely." He held her gaze. "I am asking for you, and for Prue, who I am fonder of than I have any particular right to be, and who I would consider it an honor to keep warm and comfortable and supplied with things worth laughing at for whatever years she has remaining. I have a hotel with room enough and a kitchen that has been waiting its whole life for what you make, and a life that has been emptier than I let myself notice until a woman at the end of the market row named me a price too low for her own work, and I spent the rest of the summer trying to find a reason to keep coming back." He held the hat at his side. "Marry me. Bring your cows and your grandfather's mold, and your grandmother, and let me spend the rest of my life paying you what you are worth, which the world has not done. But I intend to." The voice came from behind Wren before she could speak. "About time," said Prue. It was louder than it needed to be. It reached the people nearest them, and then because the room had gone quiet, in the organic way of rooms where something important is happening, it carried further than that. Someone laughed. Then several people laughed. Then the laughter widened and became the sound of a room full of people who have been given permission to feel something uncomplicated and are taking it with both hands. Prue in her rolling chair looked entirely satisfied with the results. Wren turned back to Edmund. He was watching her with the patience he brought to all things, the patience of a man who has asked a direct question and will wait for a direct answer and will not fill the silence with anything lesser. "You bought my whole cart that first day," she said, "and you named my price up when I named it too low." She looked at him steadily. "I think I started to understand who you were before you had finished counting out the coins. I couldn't let myself know it then. I didn't have the room for it." She paused. "I have the room for it now." She said yes. She said it plainly, the way she said everything that mattered, and she did not look away when she said it, and she meant it entirely with the full unhurried weight of someone who does not say things she does not mean and has learned over a long time, and at some cost, not to fold away the things that are true. He put his hat back on. He took her hand. The gesture was not romantic in any theatrical sense. It was the gesture of 2 people who have made a decision together and are marking it in the plainest available way. Brief and sure. Then Prue was speaking again at her preferred volume to ensure that the people in her immediate vicinity were adequately informed of the general situation, and the people in her immediate vicinity were relaying it outward, and by the time Wren and Edmund and Prue made their way out of the competition hall, the engagement was understood by most of Harrow Creek, without any formal announcement having been made. Silas Drum left the fairgrounds before 3 o'clock. He offered no farewells to the Commerce Committee men. He spoke to no one on the way out that anyone later remembered. Within the year, he had sold off his 40 cows, released his hired men, transferred his property holdings, and moved east, which the county of Harrow Creek received as a reasonable and adequate conclusion to the matter. The whisper about Wren Calloway's spring house, the whisper that had eaten at half a summer's worth of market sales and driven her to write 2 words in the margin of a column of numbers and fold the paper away, died. The only death a whisper can die. It was drowned out by a true thing said in public by strangers with no stake in the saying and written into the county record beside a blue ribbon where it would stand. They married in November at Voss Hotel in the large dining room with the long windows that faced west toward the mountains. The room smelled of pine boughs and roasting meat and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a room that is full of people who are genuinely glad to be somewhere. Wren had not anticipated the feeling that arrived when she stood in the doorway of it. Not nervousness, not the braced quality of someone enduring a ceremony, but something simpler and more difficult to name. The feeling of a room that was hers. Not because she owned it, because she was wanted in it fully and without reservation by the man standing at the front of it who had been watching the door with the same patient attention he brought to everything. She walked in without ceremony, the way she approached most things, and Edmund looked at her, the way he had looked at her butter that first Saturday in June, with the complete focused attention of a man who has found something he was not expecting to find and intends to pay it the respect that finding deserves. The room was warm. The mountains outside the long windows were already under deep snow. Prue sat in her chair at the very front closest to the cake, wearing her good dress and her best expression, which was the expression of a woman who has been right about something important and is taking the full, unhurried measure of being right. Edmund had arranged a room for Prue on the ground floor of the hotel, south-facing, with a window that received the afternoon light from the angle she preferred. Prue inspected it once, stood at the window for a moment, and said it would do, which from Prue Calloway meant it was exactly right. The order that had doubled in the summer became the permanent order. And the permanent order grew as the hotel's reputation grew, as word of the table at Voss Hotel moved along the routes that travelers traveled, carried in letters home and in conversations at the next stop. And in the accumulating undirected word of mouth that builds a dining room's name over years without any deliberate effort from anyone. The following spring, Edmund built Wren a new spring house. Larger, lined with better stone fed by a diverted channel from the coldest section of the creek, designed with the storage arrangement she had been working around for years. He built it on a Saturday with 2 men from town and did not tell her it was happening until Friday evening, because he understood that telling her in advance would mean she had opinions about the construction which she was fully entitled to, but that the gift arrived more completely as a finished fact than as a plan requiring her input before it existed. She had opinions about the construction afterward. He heard them entirely and acted on the ones that were correct, which were most of them. She kept making the early batches herself. She was up at 3:30 when the order was at its heaviest and the lean-to door opened in the pre-dawn dark and the churn began, and the sound of it moved through the hotel the way it had always moved through every house she had worked in, low and rhythmic and purposeful. The sound of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and is doing it without apology and without audience. Edmund had offered once carefully that she could bring in someone to help with the early morning production. He had offered it in the manner of a man raising a practical matter rather than suggesting she needed assistance. She had looked at him in the way she looked at things that required patience to explain. Then she said, "This is not the part I need help with." He had not raised it again. He understood, as he had come to understand most things about her, through observation and patience rather than through asking. The early morning work was not labor to be managed or redistributed. It was the center of things. It was the 4 o'clock dark and the cold water and the paddle and the press and the clean finished pound of something made exactly right, and it was hers, and had always been hers and would remain hers for as long as she chose to make it so. Prue lived 4 more years. She spent them in the south-facing room at Voss Hotel in a chair by the window that received the afternoon light at the angle she liked, watching the main street of Harrow Creek, with the same total relentless attention she had given to everything for 79 years, and then 80 and 81 and 82 and 83. She did not soften her opinions as she aged. She did not grow more diplomatic. She had never seen the value of diplomacy and saw no reason to acquire it now. She received Edmund's hotel guests with the frank assessment of someone who has no stake in the impression she makes and therefore makes a perfect one. She expressed opinions about the traveling salesman's clothing and the cattle buyer's manners and the quality of the coffee in terms that the guests generally found either startling or delightful, depending on their dispositions. She called the county official Prewitt by the wrong name every time she encountered him, with a consistency that suggested this was not accidental, though she never confirmed it either way. She died on a Wednesday in October, in the south-facing room in her chair by the window in the afternoon light. She had been watching something on the street, a horse she found unconvincing, which she said so about quietly to no one in particular, in the manner of a woman who has never needed an audience for her observations. And then she had gone quiet, in a different way, and Wren, who had been sitting with her, had taken her hand and had held it until the breathing that had moved through the wall of every house she had ever lived in went still. It was a good death. Better than the rented acre had once seemed likely to allow. Better than the churn and the clay pot and the folded paper in the chest had seemed on the worst nights to be working toward. A warm room and a window she liked, and her granddaughter's hand, and the afternoon light coming in from the angle she preferred. The carved butter mold, her grandfather's wheat sheaf worn smooth at the handle, the lines still clear enough to press a sharp impression into every pound, sat on a shelf in the Voss Hotel kitchen for 40 years after that. Long after the hotel had grown beyond what Edmund had imagined when he built it. Long after the dining room had been rebuilt once and expanded twice, and the spring house had been reconstructed entirely, and Wren's herd had grown to a size that the girl who had stood behind a handcart at the end of the market row would not have thought to imagine as a possibility. Long after the people who had whispered in July had moved on, or grown old, or simply allowed the whisper to dissolve in the way that wrongs dissolve when they stop being useful quietly, without acknowledgement, as if they had never quite happened. Long after everyone in Harrow Creek and the territory beyond had stopped thinking of Wren Calloway as the girl at the end of the market row, and had come to think of her, when they thought of her origins at all, simply as the woman whose butter made the table at Voss Hotel what it was. The butter people came back for, the butter that the dining room's reputation was built on, the butter that had been from the very beginning exactly what it appeared to be, a small, careful thing, made by someone who knew what she was doing and had always known, and had simply needed one man to stop at the end of the market row on a Saturday morning in June, and taste it the way it deserved to be tasted, and pay it what it was worth, and not look elsewhere.